and good afternoon now at this point. So I'll be providing a complement to the previous presentations that we've just heard and really providing a bit more of an overview from a humanitarian perspective and use a case study from Syria. So overall, I think many of you can tell throughout these presentations that the use of cash has been increasing in recent years. And in fact, in 2015, just 6% of humanitarian aid was delivered through cash programs. But since then, there's been a number of global commitments by multiple organizations to increase their use of cash, as it's seen to be one of the most efficient and effective modalities to reach the highest number of people in the least amount of time who have the most urgent needs in some of these acute crisis settings. And in fact, this is just a graph of IRC's commitment to cash programming, where we aim to deliver 25% of our humanitarian aid through cash by 2020, and we've already exceeded that goal a year ago. So why is there such an increased investment in cash in humanitarian settings? Well, the answer is pretty clear that it can help people meet their basic needs and improve food security in emergencies. And typically within humanitarian programmings, I think one of the key differences and contrasts from the previous programs that we've heard about is a bit more short-term in nature. And so typically they could even be one-off transfers, or more a standard approach can be just a 3-month-long transfer. So that's one of the key characteristics of cash programming in humanitarian settings. 3 other characteristics that are quite common for humanitarian settings are, 1, that it's multi-purpose cash, meaning that there's no restrictions that we're placing on how people can choose to spend their cash. The 3rd characteristic is the fact that most commonly they're unconditional cash transfers, meaning that people aren't going to have to participate in additional programming to receive cash support. And the 4th and final important characteristic within humanitarian settings is that it's just targeted towards the heads-up households based on vulnerability scores, and there's not a clear strategy as to whether the man or the woman in the home really receives the cash. And so those are the 4 key components of a cash transfer program in humanitarian settings, just in broad overview strokes, of course. And this is their theory of change. You give out cash and household basic needs are met. However, we know from all of this previous work, and really drawing from the review that Lori discussed, that there's a number of other pathways that can be occurring when cash is injected into a household. And so based off of this, we developed this theory of change with some of our programmatic colleagues as well, and we thought, well, if household basic needs are met, we thought that maybe households could also be experiencing less sexual exploitation and abuse in humanitarian settings and other negative coping. We also thought that there were a couple of pathways that might lead to intimate partner violence changes for married women in humanitarian settings. And the first one that we've been hearing about consistently from the previous presentations that were also examined was, if household basic needs are being met, maybe there's less household stress, and then maybe there could be a reduction in intimate partner violence. And then the other pathway that we were interested in exploring was whether increased access to money for women and increased control could potentially increase or decrease intimate partner violence based on a variety of factors within the couple. So we decided to explore this theory of change and specifically sought to examine how this can operate in a cash transfer program in an acute emergency setting. And so we scoped a number of potential sites where we can possibly implement this research study, and we ended up landing in Raqqa Governorate, Syria. And this study was conducted in villages where ISIS was recently withdrawn, and so humanitarian aid programming was just now starting to reach these villages. And so it really mirrored an acute emergency setting that we might see in other places. In addition, within the populations where we were conducting this research, a lot of the folks were internally displaced, fleeing Raqqa City or other places due to the civil conflict or the recent airstrikes that were in close proximity to the study timing in Raqqa City. So that's the overall setting where we conducted this study, and in order to explore these different pathways, we talked to 500 women before they received the first cash transfer, and then our typical IRC cash transfer programming was delivered for 3 months. And about 2 to 3 weeks after the final cash transfer was distributed, we went back and talked to women to understand how some of these might have changed. So what you'll note is that I just described a pre and post test with no comparison group. And so the big takeaway from all of this and limitations that we cannot confirm causality in any of these, especially compared to the great designs that other folks have talked about. But we went back and we looked at all of our quantitative findings, the in-depth interviews with women, and we had research validation workshops in country with our program team, and we really tried to figure out, well, what does this actually mean for our theory of change and what's happening when we're giving cash to these homes? And this is the theory of change that we landed on, essentially. We saw really great increases in ability of households to meet their basic needs. So cash programming in these villages in Raqqa Governorate were able to meet its primary objective, which was great. And we also saw significant reductions in food insecurity for these homes. We also found, by and large, significant reductions in negative coping, which is more of an economic term, but it actually comprises a bucket of strategies that households might turn to meet their basic needs. So this could include, in this case, significant reductions in begging and resorting to debt, in selling off assets, etc. We didn't actually find that this type of cash programming influenced exploitative work or turning to child labor, for example, but I think that seems pretty intuitive given the short-term nature of this program, and it wouldn't necessarily disincentivize these more exploitative strategies to help households meet their basic needs long-term. The other key thing that you note within this bucket is that there's no statements made about sexual abuse and exploitation. And unfortunately, just over the study period, we had to remove questions in our online survey around that due to increased scrutiny. We are still exploring that in future studies, hopefully, to understand the linkages between cash and that specific form of gender-based violence. The other key finding that you'll note is that there's no pathway anymore around reducing household stress once household basic needs are met. And this is because, in talking to the women and doing all these in-depth interviews, you would hear time and time again about how appreciative they were of the cash program and how it really helped them to get access to medicine or food or even start saving for different capital investments for their home, potentially. But when we started mapping out, what was happening over the transfer period, once we got to the end of the program, they were filled with such anxiety still because these were such short-term programs. And so it seems that when we're looking both quantitatively and qualitatively, that they kind of canceled each other out. And so we just don't think that that's a clear pathway that's happening right now with this shorter-term program. And then the other key thing that we found was a change in intimate partner violence. And one of the positive findings, we did find increased decision-making for women in these homes, particularly for married women, around joint decision-making with their partners. However, this was also correlated with an increase in intimate partner violence, and specifically looking at sexual IPV and economic abuse. And again, we can't confirm causality around these findings, but it does speak to this pathway around men potentially using violence or abuse to reassert their position and power within the home. Although, of course, there can also be other exogenous factors leading to that piece. So just from that case study and a few other studies that IRC is undertaking on cash and protection, we've identified 3 buckets, so to speak, of learning priorities that we'll be investigating over the next couple of years. And the first is around risk mitigation. And this is really to design cash programming to monitor, minimize, and prevent risks to women and girls throughout the cash transfer cycle. And in particular, for the monitoring piece, we're referring to post-distribution monitoring from our cash teams to be implementing and really supporting clear referral pathways and communication between our cash and GBV actors in the field. And we're actually piloting a toolkit around broader protection concerns in Afghanistan called Safer Cash right now. But if you're interested in more of a GBV-focused toolkit, I would refer to the Women's Refugee Commission because they have a great piece of work out on that. And then in terms of minimizing risk, just thinking about better communication with beneficiary and the target communities around this jealousy component, and developing clear exit strategies for cash programming. The other learning bucket that we're going to be taking forward is testing different design and delivery elements to maximize potential positive impacts for women. And really exciting, we actually have a follow-on study that will be returning back to Syria in a couple of weeks short time to launch a new study to develop and test plus components using a user-centered design approach with women to really hear from them how we can potentially tweak cash transfer programming in terms of labeling or other behavioral approaches, et cetera, to really help them make decisions with their husbands or their other male family members, et cetera, to empower them within the home. The other key component that's more operationally focused that we're going to be exploring is around testing different tweaks to cash programming around manipulating the gender of the recipient of cash programming, thinking about the size of the transfer, duration, et cetera, and how that might influence outcomes for women. The third and final bucket is around the scale and sustainability of cash programming and testing how to take programming at the early stages of acute crises to scale. So thinking everything that we have to do has to be very quick while assessing for contextual realities and feasibility of cash programming in these settings. And then how best to transition from short-term emergency cash to longer-term livelihoods opportunities for women. And really thinking about how we can better fill this humanitarian development early recovery continuum gap. And I hope with that there was a number of interesting pieces that we can explore further in the Q&A session. Thank you.